So picture this. A woman raised in the, velvet-draped parlors of Virginia is just completely dumped headfirst into the Mojave Desert. Total, absolute isolation. Searing heat. I mean, no polite society, just these coarse frontiersmen in an environment that is seemingly engineered to literally rip her sanity to shreds. And above it all, you have the wind.
Right.
The shrieking, omnipresent, battering ram of a wind that just never stops. It infiltrates the cabin, it cakes her skin in grit, and it slowly, methodically grinds her psychological defenses into absolute dust until she's forced into this act of desperate, bloody murder.
Cinema, the magic vehicle, a comprehensive guide. Journey 1, 1913 to 1950.
We are, of course, talking about the 1928 silent cinematic titan, The Wind, directed by Victor Sjöström and starring the legendary Lillian Gish.
Right, hold your horses, a titan. Look, it's an evocative premise, I'll give you that, but calling it a titan is a massive stretch. Half of it is a right mess. I mean, it's basically an exercise in sheer cinematic sadism wrapped up in an incredibly clunky narrative structure. Let's be real here.
Are you having a laugh? It is a masterclass. I mean, pure magic on screen. We are talking about the absolute twilight of the silent era here. It's 1928. Hollywood is undergoing this violent seismic structural collapse. The transition to the talkies wasn't just a shiny new feature. It was an industry earthquake that rendered a highly evolved, purely visual language instantly obsolete. Think about it for you listeners out there. It's like the shift from physical media to streaming, but 1,000 times faster and more ruthless. We are looking at a film born directly in the crosshairs of an apocalyptic shift in the art form. The studios were importing East Coast Broadway actors by the trainload just to replace silent stars who couldn't project across the soundstage.
Right, exactly. The industry was in a total train wreck of a transition, but that doesn't excuse the film itself being ragged around the edges. I mean, Sjöström was scrambling. The studios were terrified. You've got this massive clash between an auteur trying to make nature the primary antagonist and a studio system desperate to keep the lights on while they frantically, wired their sound stages for audio. It shows on the screen. It's shoddy.
Let me stop you before you go any further. Sjöström wasn't scrambling, all right? He was executing a pristine, uncompromising vision. Let's actually look at the environment he constructed.
Oh.
So they adapted Dorothy Scarborough's novel, right? They bring on Frances Marion to write the screenplay, and they do not hold back. They drop Lillian Gish's character, Letty Mason Hightower, directly into the meat grinder. She arrives in this land of harsh landscapes and rough people, and her culture shock isn't just missing fine china. She is forced to stand there and watch her sister-in-law literally butcher a freshly slaughtered side of beef. It's a sublime, visceral anchor to show her total, absolute alienation from this world.
Come off it. That scene is clunky as hell. I mean, it's literal poverty porn for a 1920s audience.
Oh, look at the delicate little flower faced with a carcass. It's half-baked melodrama, mate. The contrast is jarring, sure, but it's laid on with a trowel. The local customs frighten her. The living conditions disgust her. Yes, we get it. We get it in the first 5 minutes. But he just keeps hammering it.
Listen to yourself. You're entirely missing the psychological bedrock being laid down there. It's a stroke of brilliance in visual storytelling. That butchering scene is the exact moment she realizes she is completely, utterly unequipped to survive here on her own, which is exactly what forces her into the loveless marriage with Lige, the local farmer played by Lars Hansen. And it is relentlessly bleak. When he tries to kiss her after the wedding, she physically recoils, like she rejects him entirely because she is utterly repulsed by her own survival mechanism. While Lige is arguably the only character who isn't utterly flat in this whole affair. He's remarkably noble, frankly. I mean, he accepts the rejection. He decides to, leave her alone on the prairie to go raise the money so she can escape back to Virginia, which, logically, leaves her entirely at the mercy of the elements. It's a convenient plot device to get her alone in the cabin.
Exactly. Because the environment isn't just a backdrop. It is an active, malign force. It breeds brutality. The isolation she experiences when Lige leaves is profound. It's not just physical, it's deeply psychological. The landscape actively wants her dead.
Wait, hold on. This is where I don't buy it for a second. Let's talk about the so-called psychological depth here, because you keep praising it. Later in the story, Letty allegedly has this massive change of heart towards Lige. After being battered by the wind and the isolation, she suddenly decides she loves him. Pull the other one. Are we seriously meant to view that as genuine romantic affection? I mean, from a modern psychological perspective, that is a textbook trauma bond. It's Stockholm Syndrome via meteorology.
But that's a phenomenal point, actually. That doesn't make it a flaw. It makes it brilliant. The sheer grinding terror of her daily existence fundamentally rewires her brain. When your baseline reality is constant, inescapable threat, when the wind is literally trying to tear your house down, anyone who offers even a flimsy wooden door between you and the gale becomes an object of intense, desperate dependency. The environment has beaten her into submission so completely that she clings to Lige because he is literally the only thing in her world that isn't the wind.
Precisely. So it isn't love, it's a survival instinct kicking in because she's on the verge of total cognitive collapse. And that cognitive collapse brings us to the third act, which is where the film just completely loses the plot for me. Enter Wirt Roddy.
Montague Love playing the suave cattle dealer. He's a physical manifestation of a different kind of threat entirely. He's had designs on Letty from the start, and with Lige gone, he makes his move. But Letty, who was already pushed to the absolute brink of madness by the isolation, pulls a gun on him in self-defense.
And Roddy, being a completely one-dimensional, cartoonish villain, mocks her. He underestimates a cornered animal. They struggle, the gun goes off, and he accidentally gets killed. Fine, it's a standard melodramatic inciting incident. But the aftermath is where Sjöström's execution goes from ambitious to just laughably weak.
Absolute nonsense. The aftermath is pure magic. Letty drags Roddy's body out into the desert, right? She is frantically digging, dumping sand on the corpse, desperate to conceal the crime. And the wind, this ceaseless, omnipotent force, relentlessly blows the sand away, uncovering the face of the man she just killed. Again and again. Sjöström, working with the cinematographer John Arnold, achieves something completely unmatched in silent cinema here. They sustain an atmosphere of just suffocating dread across the entire 20-80-meter length of the film.
You're romanticizing a visual mess. Do you know how they actually shot that? They dragged 8 massive airplane propellers out to the Mojave Desert and just blasted sand at the actors in 120-degree heat. The temperature literally melted the emulsion right off the film stock inside the camera magazines. Lillian Gish suffered severe physical burns on her face from the hot sand. You call it unmatched. I call it an amateurish, unhinged production. It's a director torturing his crew because he couldn't figure out a more elegant, controlled way to convey weather.
That is exactly why it's jaw-dropping. He didn't compromise. To visualize the invisible, to make an audience truly, viscerally feel the psychological weight of the wind without a single sound effect. You couldn't just use a fan in a studio. It requires that level of physical reality. And we really should bring in that fascinating footnote from the historical sources here about Genghis Khan.
Oh, you are not seriously bringing up Genghis Khan right now. That is a massive stretch.
Listen. The source explicitly draws this parallel, and it is a stroke of brilliance. Genghis Khan, the man who united the Central Asian tribes, built an empire stretching from Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe. The wind in this film operates exactly like Genghis Khan's sweeping forces. It's this unstoppable, vast, conquering entity that pays absolutely no mind to borders or human emotions. It just rolls over the landscape, completely subjugating everything in its path, just as the wind brutally subjugates Letty.
You're taking the mick. A Genghis Khan metaphor. It's wind, mate. It blows sand around. And when he layers in those visual metaphors, like that recurring superimposition of the phantom horse with its mane wild in the storm clouds, that is a definition of clunky, literal-minded nonsense. Look, the wind is like a big, scary horse. It's utterly flat. Sjöström is just hammering the audience over the head because he severely lacks subtlety.
Look, the academic foundation in the source text, cinema, the magic vehicle, is razor sharp on this point. Klonowski and Garbitz break down how Sjöström wasn't just throwing shots together, he was forging a completely new cinematic vocabulary from scratch. They rank this as a towering milestone for a reason. He pushed the medium forward because he had the sheer guts to execute a vision nobody else could even comprehend.
Come off it. I reckon the authors are giving him a massive free pass here. You call it visionary courage, but from where I'm sitting, it looks like a colossal ego trip. Just because a filmmaker spends a fortune, tortures his crew with airplane propellers, and drags out every single scene doesn't automatically make it high art. He was a narcissist behind a lens, and I think the book is completely romanticizing what is essentially a tedious, overblown project.
Nonsense. You're completely missing the forest for the trees. It's not an ego trip, it's spatial innovation. The book provides the precise historical context and technical breakdowns that directly influenced modern cinema. If your attention span finds high-level visual storytelling a bit of a grind, that's your problem, not the film's.
I'm evaluating what's actually on the screen, mate. It's 50% brilliance and 50% unmitigated chaos. The book defends every single frame through this cozy historical lens, but any rational viewer today would tell you to throw half that footage in the bin, chop 40 minutes out of the middle, and you might actually have a watchable picture. It's bloated.
Look, we've argued through dozens of these masterpieces, and we're clearly never going to see eye to eye. If you want to judge for yourself whether my colleague here is just being an insufferable cynic, or if the book actually proves its point, go grab a copy. Do you have the actual appetite to digest real film history, or are you staying lazy? Your call.
And while you're reading up on history, let's talk about Irving Thalberg. Because if you want to understand why this film ends up as a compromised, half-baked mess, you have to look at the studio interference.
Oh, right. Okay, here we go. The Thalberg Compromise. Because Sjöström and Gish originally engineered a purely tragic, completely uncompromising conclusion to this film. After the sheer terror of the murder and the wind constantly unearthing Wertroddy's corpse, Letty's mind shatters. In the original cut, she wanders out into the howling wilderness and the elements completely consume her. The storm wins. It's bleak, it's devastating, and it's perfect.
Which is nihilistic and terrible for business. Irving Thalberg, MGM's head of production, steps in. He's looking at a massively expensive, location-shot silent film in 1928, right as the studio is bleeding capital, trying to retrofit their entire theater chains and sound stages for audio. He knows a depressing ending where America's sweetheart just wanders off and dies in the dirt is going to utterly tank at the box office. So what does he do? He enforces classical narrative structure, he demands a reshoot. Lige returns with the money, Letty magically snaps out of her psychosis, finds her courage, and boldly declares she's no longer afraid of the wind.
And it is a travesty. It completely undermines the entire picture. But what drives me absolutely insane is that the source text, the exact same academics who praise Sjöström's visual vocabulary, actually claim this studio-mandated change was very fortunate. They argue it resulted in a beautiful, lucidly constructed, and psychologically consistent film.
And they are entirely correct. For once, the book actually talks sense.
You cannot be serious. You just spent 10 minutes vehemently arguing that her attachment to Lige was a toxic trauma bond, and now you're defending a forced Hollywood happy ending where her severe PTSD is instantly, magically cured because her husband walked through the front door.
I am defending the necessity of structure, mate. 1920s audiences viewed cinema as morality plays. If you present a 90-minute gauntlet of sheer suffering that ends in a meaningless death, the audience rejects it as a shoddy, unearned slog. Thalberg understood commercial psychology. Resolving the tension provides complete character arc. She faces the antagonist, the wind, and she triumphs. It saves the film from being this indulgent, avant-garde depression spiral.
No way, stop right there. It's a cowardly concession to the lowest common denominator. Thalberg stripped the film of its fangs.
Yeah.
But, I guess it perfectly mirrors the larger tectonic destruction happening around them at MGM. The studios were absolutely terrified of alienating audiences because the talkies were already stealing their attention. Lillian Gish, at 34, was fighting a war on two fronts. The studio executives meddling with the script and the rapidly shifting culture itself.
Well, let's be fair, Gish was the only reason the film even existed in the first place. She championed it. She pushed for it after seeing William K. Howard's White Gold in 1927, which had a very similar stark realism. But let's be brutally honest about Gish's acting style here. It was rooted in this deep, intense sincerity that often teetered right on the edge of saccharine exaggeration. It was already looking dated.
Phenomenal work, though. She was an absolute master. She understood how to convey profound, complex emotion purely through physicality and facial expression.
Yes, for the 1910s and early 20s. But the culture was accelerating rapidly. You had the rise of the, what do they call them, the easygoing Charleston heroines. Joan Crawford was stepping onto the lot. Audiences wanted modern, fast-talking, cynical flappers. They didn't want suffering Victorian waifs gazing tragically into the middle distance. Gish was a relic playing an outdated archetype, and the talkies just exposed that.
That is a staggering misread of her talent and the historical context. The issue wasn't her acting. The issue was the primitive, clunky technology of early sound. Sound completely destroyed the freedom of the camera. To shoot a talkie in 1928, you had to lock the camera inside a massive, soundproof wooden box. They literally called it an ice box, so the microphone wouldn't pick up the grinding of the gears. You had actors forced to stand absolutely rigid next to flower pots with omnidirectional microphones hidden inside them, just enunciating perfectly into these waxed Vitaphone systems. It killed the fluidity and poetry of silent cinema overnight.
Which proves my exact point. It was an adapt or die moment for the industry. Gish couldn't transition smoothly into the early talkies because her entire skill set relied on a medium that simply no longer existed.
But she did adapt. She pivoted to the stage. And decades later, she delivered jaw-dropping work in episodic film roles. King Vidor's Duel in the Sun in 46, Charles Laughton's The Night of the Hunter. She survived and thrived. But Sjöström. Sjöström is a truly fascinating figure here because he recognized the mechanical limitations you just described, and he flat out refused to degrade his art.
He ran away, you mean?
He drew a line in the sand. This man went from the sweeping European seascapes of his early career, you look at a man there was, to the brutal, unforgiving deserts of the wind. He was an absolute master of the visual medium. It's exactly like an elite analog vinyl producer in the late 1990s refusing to use Pro Tools. The technology changes, the industry demands digitized, auto-tuned sound, and rather than compromise his craft, he simply packs up his studio and walks away at the absolute height of his powers.
Hang on a minute. That is a wildly romanticized spin on a director simply failing to adapt to a new toolset. I mean, he was deeply unhappy with the narrative styles imposed by sound cinema, sure. So instead of, learning how to master audio editing, he retreats to Sweden, directs 2 more silent films out of sheer stubbornness, makes 1 mediocre sound picture in England in 1937 under the red robe, and then basically vanishes from the director's chair. It's not immense artistic integrity. He was inflexible.
It is the literal definition of integrity. He knew his genius lay in making an audience hear the howling of the wind without ever playing a single sound effect. He refused to dilute that into a literal clunky medium where actors just read stiff dialogue into a bush. And his story doesn't end there. He stays in the industry. He acts as an artistic advisor to Svensk film industry, mentoring the next generation of Swedish filmmakers. And then, at 78 years old, he delivers one of the most sublime final acts in cinema history.
All right, I'll give this one detail. His performance as Professor Isak Borg in Ingmar Bergman's Wild Strawberries is good.
It is a transcendent return. Bergman absolutely revered him as a pioneer. It closes the loop on his career beautifully. He returns not as a compromised director hacking out Studio B movies for a paycheck, but as a revered elder statesman acting in an undisputed masterpiece of world cinema.
It's fine work, yes.
Yeah.
But let's not pretend an acting gig in the 50s washes away the reality of The Wind. You're trying to use his later career to justify a deeply flawed, bloated film from 30 years prior.
Which brings us to the ultimate question about this film, standing right on the precipice of silent cinema's extinction. Because every single frame of The Wind is loaded with the terror of the characters and the acute anxiety of the artist making it. Think about the Thalberg Compromise. Think about how much of our beloved artistic history is shaped not by the pure, uncompromising intent of the artist, but by a studio executive's sheer, unadulterated terror of the audience's reaction. What if Thalberg hadn't interfered? What if Sjöström and Gish had released their original tragic ending where Letty's mind fractures completely and she walks out into the storm to die? Would The Wind be celebrated today as an even greater, totally uncompromising masterpiece?
Or would it have been rightfully binned by 1928 audiences as an unbearable, pretentious slog, bankrupting the studio and completely disappearing into the sands of time? Let's be brutally honest here. Without the studio forcing it into a somewhat watchable shape, it would have been a total commercial bloodbath. Thalberg saved that movie from its own director's hubris.
That's a profoundly cynical view. I think audiences, even back then, can handle the dark. They could handle the tragedy of the human condition without needing a neat little bow tied on it. Sjöström trusted the audience. Thalberg feared them.
You're living in a fantasy world, mate. They would have walked out in droves. You can't just inflict relentless, grinding misery on a paying crowd and call it a masterpiece because it's visually interesting. It's a right mess without that ending, and you know it.
I know nothing of the sort. It's the ending that makes it ragged around the edges. You're just parroting a studio talking point from 100 years ago.